Ready Player One is a 2011 novel by Ernest Cline, which was recently adapted into a feature film by Cline and Zach Penn with director Steven Spielberg. Both tell the story of Wade Watts, a young man in a near future where a virtual reality called the Oasis has almost completely superseded traditional human existence. Basically imagine if The Matrix was also Second Life. This reality's creator, an introverted pop culture geek named James Halliday, upon his death leaves the keys to his empire and massive fortune hidden within the Oasis itself, meaning whoever discovers these Easter eggs in his simulation will essentially rule the new world. Wade and his online friends are among those hunting to unlock the secrets of Halliday's world, but find themselves entangled in the schemes of a corporation seeking to control the Oasis for their own nefarious capitalist means. A lot has been said about the merits and failings of Ready Player One in both of its forms. Some say it is an earnest, if fanciful reflection of modern society's relationship to technology and pop culture. Others say it is a homogenous, overhyped piece of fan fiction that glorifies everything wrong with fandom. There are any number of topics to be examined, such as how it uses intertextuality to its utmost extreme, its simplistic blog-like prose, or the shockingly tone-deaf way it frames its female characters. I won't elaborate too much on this, but if you really want to understand Cline's issue and or punish yourself, try reading this poem of his. Go on. I dare you not to cringe.
Men who can only get it up for monosyllabic cock-hungry nymphos with gargantuan breasts and a 3-word vocabulary. Adult films are populated with these collagen-injected, liposuction women, many of whom have resorted to surgery and self-mutilation in an attempt to look the way they have been told to look. These aren't real women, they're objects. And these movies aren't erotic, they're pathetic. These vacuum-headed fuck bunnies don't turn me on, they disgust me, and it's not that I'm against pornography, I mean, I'm a guy.
What I want to focus on today is how Ready Player One in both mediums, whether intentionally or not, validates a toxic ideology, defining oneself entirely by the media you consume. It's easy enough to brush past this issue by simply saying things like, Wade Watts is an awful dipshit who can't function in the real world, or the story postulates that being a gatekeeping fanboy makes you superior, but that's too easy. My goal here is to make sense of this mindset, to examine not only why this is a flaw in the story, but how it's having such a nightmarish impact on real-world discourse. Why do I feel I'm the right person to do this? Well, honestly, it's because not that long ago, I was Wade Watts. Yeah, this is about to get real personal for a bit, but hear me out. I spent much of my formative years either being isolated from or outright avoiding traditional social interaction. Instead, I drowned myself in movies, video games, etc. to fill the hole, and though it helped me cope, it also left me in a state of arrested development. For a very long time, I couldn't hold a conversation about anything but what some people would call nerd shit. Every moment not spent watching a movie or playing a game was just filler to me. I couldn't even concentrate on anything without my mind drifting into fantasy. I began to define myself completely by my all-consuming interests. I wore practically nothing but geeky t-shirts. Any money I had, or sometimes didn't have, always went into supporting my hobbies, and I had little interest in doing anything else to better myself. I was eventually able to turn my obsession into something productive by pursuing a writing career, but even so I was still something of an empty shell. There was a great deal of comfort in shielding myself within the realms of make-believe, but this mindset fueled by anxiety and rejection ultimately not only isolated me more, but also blinded me to the truth about myself. I hid behind my esoteric interests not because I lacked a personality. I hid because whenever my true self did pop out, usually obliviously, I'd get nothing in return but ridicule and self-hatred. Trying to be myself felt like yet another task not worth taking when I could just further dampen the pain with another role-playing game. So I committed myself for years to the most elaborate RPG of them all, The Closet. So when I read Ready Player One as a geeky, ostensibly straight white guy, I was hooked. It appealed to every piece of nerd ephemera I'd basically dedicated my life to. It made me feel smart for getting its obscure references, and hungry to look up all those I didn't. It told a story that unapologetically reflected my existence and showed me as the hero. Well, at least I told myself I did, because in actuality, I found myself relating more to characters like Artemis and H, those who hid in the Oasis for reasons beyond nerdy obsession. It took me a few more years to come to terms with myself as a transgender woman, but once I did, that tendency to hide diminished greatly. I still love all the same stuff and will geek out when given the opportunity, but I no longer need it to survive. It does not define who I am. So now when I look back on Ready Player One, especially in light of the film adaptation, I feel an incredibly different gut feeling. Instead of filling me with glee and optimism, I now just see the jumbled fragments of a former hollow existence. A life dedicated not to myself, but the pursuit of an immaterial bliss in other people's imaginations. Now obviously I don't think most internet fanboys are going through exactly what I did, but I do think there's a likely commonality. We're all compensating for what we're missing, whatever that may be. Some people escape to the realms of fiction just for a brief respite from the real world, but others are so scared and beaten down by reality that they just want to stay in make-believe. They could lack proper support from family and peers. They may lack employment or the tangible skills required to gain it. They could be enduring ridicule for how they look or what their interests are. They may be suffering in silence with an undiagnosed mental illness, or yes, be a closeted member of the LGBTQ community. Whatever their individual problem may be, I believe that this inability to live comfortably in reality is what leads many to drown themselves in nerddom. That's what the Oasis is offering, and why it's so enticing. It's a fresh start in a new reality where you can be anyone and do anything, and where nerd culture reigns supreme because its creator really liked classic arcade games and Matthew Broderick movies. This idea is reflected in many of the story's characters. Wade Watts escapes the Oasis because he has a terrible home life. Artemis is self-conscious about her appearance, and H pretends to be a straight white guy to escape the discrimination she faces as a black lesbian. Halliday himself created the Oasis as his own idealized version of a perfect world, but at the cost of his personal relationships and the woman he loved, all because he just couldn't connect with people in the real world. Whilst never outright confirmed in story, Halliday was most likely on the autism spectrum. All of these characters are marginalized in some fashion and use the Oasis as an escape, and you see that all the time in real life. The internet has opened a lot of doors to those who felt different, with anonymity allowing people to explore new perspectives and express themselves in ways they might fear to in the real world. However, while some use those experiences to better themselves in their regular lives, others choose to shelter themselves away, or worse, to destroy. It's hard to deny, but the real Oasis would probably look less like this, and a lot more like this.
I think you know the way, Mr. Unaddicted Man.
What the internet has done for nerd culture is astounding. What was once always the fringe group in your society has grown so ever-present that it has overtaken the pop culture landscape. This is because the internet has finally allowed these communities to find each other across wide swaths of land and sea, showing each other that they aren't as alone as they once thought. However, despite the vast sea change in how typical society views things like Marvel Comics and Dungeons & Dragons, a lot of these self-professed hardcore nerds still latch onto the concept that they are a marginalized community. Now, marginalization in society has always been around, and it's quickly found its way into online discourse too. No matter your racial heritage, religious beliefs, sexual orientation, or gender identity, you are going to find a sizable group of people who just outright hate you, often without any tangible reason why. These days we see radical fringe groups use platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to attack supposed degenerates, spread lies and rumours, and get away with it because they remain anonymous and abuse the very concept of free speech. This kind of ideology is often born from feelings of marginalisation, but not in the traditional sense. They believe that because actually disenfranchised communities are starting to have their voices heard and human rights upheld, that somehow will diminish their voices and rights. Whether it is supporters of the alt-right, religious fanatics, TERFs, etc., these admittedly small groups are vocal enough and amplified by their use of the internet to negatively influence society, culture, and politics. However, these methods of antagonism aren't entirely new. They've just grown more politically charged, and therefore getting more media coverage from mainstream outlets. Nerd culture has always used these tactics to spread their misplaced hatred. The main difference is, however, they're not talking about things like voting rights and equality protection acts. They're talking about how they don't like that a traditionally white character is now being played by someone of colour, or that their favourite game series is being taken over by the feminist agenda. There's always been a toxicity to fandom, and in the old days it was easy enough to write it all off as immaturity, entitlement, and an inability to properly express an opinion. However, in the MAGA era, things have risen to a whole new level. Nerd culture online has advanced beyond complaining about bat nipples and midichlorians to abhorrent actions that have real-world consequences. Internet groups trying to bomb progressive films with negative reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, women and people of colour being driven off of social media by racist and misogynistic posts, and the spreading of conspiracy theories like Disney paying off critics or the oh-so-fabled Snyder Cut. This is the image fandom now has in many people's heads.
I want Szechuan sauce! Where's my Szechuan sauce? I'm Pickle Rick! What beloved dum-dum!
They sure don't represent the mass majority of the community, but to write them off as fringe nutcases and just ignore them is an irresponsible view. These poisonous thoughts don't just form in a vacuum. Like with certain political views, they are born out of feelings of entitlement and the loss of it. The thing is, a lot of our pop culture began to define itself in a less than enlightened time. A time when straight white cis men were even more powerful than they are now, where anyone who wasn't was automatically lesser. As such, much of the stories we all grew up on, even those tales born in far more progressive times, still reflect the view that straight white cis man is the default. Everyone else simply had to accept it. This is why it took so long for me to realise I'm transgender. Because every important story was supposedly about me, and any story about anyone else wasn't meant to appeal to me. It was for them. But here's the thing, for better or worse, I learned to empathise with characters regardless of their background or identity, and many others from diverse points of view did too. That then inspired some of us to become storytellers, and create narratives that reflect our truths, in hopes others would learn to relate to our struggles as we did to theirs. Unfortunately, it seems a vocal number of people refuse to, or are simply incapable of doing so. Worse still, just like the political extremists who believe equal rights means taking away theirs, these concerned fans think any media that doesn't completely reflect their existence or shows even the slightest criticism of their culture is
ruining everything,
and that
politics should stay out of my entertainment.
Not only is this a narrow and frankly bigoted point of view, it is flat out wrong. As much of the foundations of pop culture stay the same, they also change to reflect the times, and to try and remove them from those influences completely robs them of what made them stick to the cultural zeitgeist in the first place. To demonstrate, let's take a look at two major franchises that have taken flack from the fans recently for having an agenda their predecessors supposedly never had. Firstly, and I know we all thought we could put this one to bed, Ghostbusters 2016. Now, it's well documented what the immediately obvious problem people had with this movie from its inception, but in practice, the real rift between the reboot and the original is based far less on gender than meets the eye. You see, most people tend to forget this, but the original Ghostbusters is, well, maybe it's not that politically right-wing. I guess you would call it libertarian? Whatever, it's definitely not a liberal film. The main characters are, at least from the skeptical point of view, conspiracy-believing fringe scientists booted from their university who decide to set up a business to profit from their discoveries. Heck, if it needed to be more obvious, the human villain of the movie is the Environmental Protection Agency. Yes, as much as the film paints him as an arsehole, Walter Peck was right to investigate the Ghostbusters, and the situation only gets as bad as it does because Peter Venkman directly antagonises him and refuses to cooperate. Conversely, Ghostbusters 2016 is a clearly liberal film, and more than just because of the hormonal makeup of its leads. The main characters here don't set up their business to make money or for the sake of their arrogant egos. They do it because they're trying to prove their worth to a society that constantly underestimates and belittles them. Their attempts to warn the public about their discoveries leads them being labelled as sad, crazy women by the media and government, despite the latter being completely aware they are telling the truth. And who is the villain in this version? A put-upon, antisocial conspiracy theorist who wants to destroy the world for not accepting him. Heck, the Ghostbusters here actually do try to reason with Rowan instead of writing him off as a loon because hey, empathy and themes and whatnot. But he rejects their sympathy as disingenuous and instead lambasts them for being, well, women. Yeah, it's hardly a tactful way to deal with the situation, but then again neither is engaging in petty insults about dicklessness when the world is literally at stake. Whilst the original Ghostbusters is admittedly the superior film, and the reboot loses a lot of points for how it antagonises its detractors rather than opening up more sympathetic communication, both films are a valid reflection of the socio-political climate they were conceived in. Even if Ghostbusters 2016 had featured, I don't know, Dwayne Johnson and Jack Black as its lead instead of Kristen Wiig and Melissa McCarthy, it still wouldn't capture the exact same feeling as the original because that film could have only come out of the Reaganomics era of capitalism. Then again, it seems America is kind of going through a sloppy imitation of the Reagan years right now anyway, so the reboot was too ahead of its time? But the more obvious big gun in this story is Star Wars, the perennial ruined my childhood fanbase since 1997. Now, anyone who attempts to tell you that Star Wars is completely removed from anything in reality is just kidding themselves. George Lucas created the franchise not only by drawing upon Arthurian legend, Akira Kurosawa's samurai flicks, and the B-movie sci-fi serials of his childhood, but also from then current events. A New Hope was written during the Vietnam War, and the plight of the Rebel Alliance against the Empire reflects Lucas's generation's frustrations with the Nixon administration. The prequels reflect upon the past with allusions to Greek tragedy and the works of Shakespeare. Seriously, Revenge of the Sith is basically an alt version of Julius Caesar where Brutus kills Cassius instead, but it is also allegorical for the Bush administration and the conflicts in the Middle East. At least that's what Lucas says. Okay, I never said it was done in an elegant way, but there are definitely intentions of something greater, even if it isn't always clear. And so by the time you get to the sequel trilogy, once again the setup is a fairly obvious allegory for our current times. The First Order represents the resurgence of fascism that glorifies the good old days, but is really just a cheap edgelord imitation. The Resistance are a ragtag few good guys who actually stand up to this threat instead of just dithering about like the New Republic, and look what happens to them. It just so happens that our heroes more closely resemble society as we know it today too. Instead of once again two white guys and a white woman, we have a white woman, a black man, a Latino, and an Asian. The lines between good and evil have become blurrier, our old heroes have either disappointed us or been defeated by this new outlook, and what worked in the past is not necessarily what we need anymore to secure a brighter future. The new films reflect our society just as much as the old films, but here's the key difference. The hardcore audience has grown up. Those who grew up watching the original films and even the prequels did so without fully understanding the socio-political undertones. They just got the whimsical sci-fi fantasies that kids were looking for. Yes, Star Wars is still primarily for kids, shut up, and never looked past that. But now as adults, those analogies are much clearer, and remind them that they are no longer that wide-eyed kid playing with their action figures. Instead of, you know, accepting the newfound profundity of their childhood passion and learning new lessons from them, these OG fans lash out and take destructive actions to try and force the franchise, and by proxy themselves, back into that place of innocent comfort. This is where Ready Player One falls apart once you get past the gleeful escapism of the concept. It doesn't commit to being about anything beyond nerd porn. Much like the fanbase it panders to, the only thing it seems dedicated to is its own immaturity, which prevents it from engaging the zeitgeist in ways it easily could have. It fetishizes the pop culture of the 1980s, but not because it has anything particularly interesting to say about it beyond "wasn't this stuff cool?" It pays lip service to topical issues like net neutrality and online anonymity, but they're not explored in any sort of depth. It attempts to be inclusive with supporting characters of varying gender, race, and sexual identities, but it falls back on stereotypes and cliches when not outright misrepresenting them. But most importantly, by being so unashamedly geeky, it in turn condones so many of the worst practices of fandom. Wade Watts is portrayed as the hero of the story, but he engages in some terrible behaviour throughout his adventure. He brags about how knowledgeable he is about various nerdy topics and how that makes him superior to other gunters. His reckless attempt to say screw you to the man gets several people, including his aunt, killed, and yet he feels little remorse about it. He lusts after Artemis and continues to stalk her even after she's outright rejected him. He uses transphobic rhetoric when talking about both her and H after he finds out her true identity. I could go on. Whilst I wouldn't class Wade as an outright troll himself, he is just deluded and socially inept enough to be the poster boy for every butthurt delusional incel, and thereby helps condone their own abhorrent behaviour. Admittedly, the film version attempts to fix a lot of these issues, but in doing so it just takes a problematic story and makes it generic. Instead of the key to the challenges encouraging elitism by being based around gaming skill or pop culture knowledge, they are instead puzzles where you have to look past the game and have a deeper understanding of Halliday and his work. Wade is now less of a sheltered and entitled dick, but he's not given much to compensate for that change and instead just comes off as a bland cipher. Whilst his controversial relations with Artemis and H are reduced, but still present and not effectively called out. By the end of the story, Wade doesn't learn to value himself as more than a human nerd encyclopedia, or to use his newfound wealth to help fix the planet's crumbling infrastructure and economy, or even learn that the way he treated Artemis was creepy and entitled. He shares his wealth with just his friends, severs business ties with the one evil company, decides the virtual world should be turned off a couple times a week with no real thought to the potential ramifications of that, and otherwise lives a cozy existence with his placated girlfriend, surrounded by the nerd stuff he oh so loves. This wants to be an epic story about the disenfranchised fighting against the establishment, but in reality it's just gamers wanting validation for their insular lifestyle choices. To be fair, I don't think Ernest Cline was trying to write the Gamergate Manifesto or something. From everything I've gleaned about him as a person, he seems like an innocent and good-natured guy, but you don't exactly have to dig deep to see that he isn't that unlike Wade himself. His first ever screenplay was a spec sequel to Buckaroo Banzai. His only other produced writing credits are co-writing the script to Fanboys and his second novel Armada, which is basically just, what if Ready Player One, but also Last Starfighter? He drives around in multiple modded DeLoreans, and need I mention that poem again?
But I don't want to watch this misogynist He-Man woman hater porn. I want porno movies that are made with guys like me in mind. Guys who know that the sexiest thing in the world is a woman who is smarter than you are.
I'm just saying, I don't think he's a bad person, but he doesn't strike me as the type who wants to rattle the cages much either. Ready Player One condones a lifestyle and outlook based purely around pop culture, specifically one where the wider context of those works is ignored in favour of providing nostalgia cushioning. It appeals to the geek community not because it challenges them or helps them better understand themselves, but because it invents a scenario that congratulates them for doing nothing. It fails to understand the mental and personality disorders that can spring from a mindset that is based purely around fandom, and that's why some of these people get so violently defensive when their stuff is changed or criticised. Their entire reason for existing is being threatened. No, Ready Player One does not objectively do anything bad, but through its unintentional ignorance it endorses that worldview, making it complicit in the negativity it inspires. It is exactly what happens when you do try to take socio-political influence out of storytelling. You are left with just self-indulgent pandering, which is exactly what most franchises would be these days if left to the desires of the petulant fans. Does that mean I hate Ready Player One and anyone that likes it? No, of course not. I understand why it's appealing, because It appealed to me once. In many ways, I wish I could like it again. But I'm a different person now in a lot of ways, and one of those ways is that I can separate myself from my passions. As I sat in that cinema and watched the movie, as the Iron Giant fought against Mechagodzilla with the assistance of a Gundam and Chucky, I just felt a guttural regret for the life I once lived. I knew once I would have loved this, but now... nothing. Those euphoric feelings I once could only find in these kinds of indulgences, I can now find them in all corners of my life, and all I had to do was just be myself. So to those of you out there who feel like your fandom is being ruined by the liberals or feminists, or claim superiority over the fake gamer girls because you're an OG fan, first stop that, like, now, seriously. But then, take a step back. Take a look at your life. Be honest with yourself. Find the true internal source of your discomfort, and please spend your energies combating that instead. To put it simply, and to paraphrase the words of David Byrne, you just need to ask yourself, well, how did I get here?